Welcome to Knowledgeable Aging. I'm your host, Jason Kotar. Joining us today to talk about healing dementia is Kyrié Carpenter. Kyrié is a corporate coach and ageism activist. She is the co-founder of the anti-ageism clearinghouse oldschool.info and the editor of the Changing Aging blog. Kyrié is the author of the book Healing Dementia that was featured in the New York Times and has spoken at the International Alzheimer's Association Conference and the Eden Alternative Conference. How are you doing today, Kyrié?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back, Jason.
Excellent. Looking forward to our conversation. But before we get started, Kyrié, for those that are joining us for the live webinar, if you have any questions, type your questions in to the chat box. Time permitting, we'll do everything in our power to get your questions answered. So Kyrié, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We're going to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, healing dementia. We're going to be working through, it is a book, as Jason mentioned, that I wrote. And so just to set your expectations, I'm going to read the book. Don't worry, it only takes a couple minutes. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how the book came to be and then unpack some of the ideas in it a little bit further because they can be a little bit woolly. But first, to just get us all on the same page, I am going to read the story, Healing Dementia, to you all. All right, Healing Dementia. When we are born, we use very little cognition. We learn from the world by receiving input from all directions. In childhood, we learn to name the world and to understand it. And we continue to delight in the in all its mystery. In the cult of adulthood, cognition serves us, and we rely on it more and more. We forget the value of the and fear the unknown, the unconscious, the unexplainable. Dementia, out of mind. Other ways of knowing and the overpower the fortress of cognition. And in a world that values the mind and cognition above all else, this shift in consciousness causes socially imposed suffering. Valiant and horrific efforts are made to return to the way things were or to hide the changes. And eventually, to hide the person experiencing them under the false pretense of healing and caring. And yet, the phenomenon of dementia can be a teacher, a guide, a guru, showing us how to heal our cognition-obsessed world. Dementia teaches us to value all ways of knowing and the And to heal dementia and our world, we must all choose to value the raw material of childhood, the usefulness of adulthood, and the treasure of elderhood. An intentional integration of cognition, other ways of knowing, and the to form a brilliant clarity of unimpeded awareness. Now, I wrote this book because I wanted to share some ideas that I learned while working with elders living with dementia. It's short and it has a lot of visual art because that is how I learned is the best way to communicate both to people living with dementia and those that love them who are short on time. And I wanted something that if it was sitting on the table in a doctor's office, you could pick up and thumb through and return to again and again. So it very intentionally has a lot of big ideas packed into a very small package that you can come back to again and again with some pretty visceral images as well. And I got these ideas I was training to be a therapist, and for my clinical training, I ended up working in a long-term care community, and all of my clients had a diagnosis of dementia. And while I was working with these clients, I began to notice that the people I was spending my days with weren't matching up with the ideas and stereotypes I held in my head about what someone living with dementia is like. I wasn't meeting any shells of themselves. I wasn't having any long goodbyes. Sure, my therapy sessions definitely weren't your traditional 50 minutes, client comes to your office, recap about what we talked about the last week, set goals for the next one. Most of my clients never learned my name. It's a pretty hard one for people even without cognitive change. But regardless of us not knowing each other's names or maybe having these markers of time, these cognitive connections, we were forming really deep connections and relationships on more of an emotional and physical level. And up until that point in my life, I had really been told, like so many of us, that the part of me that mattered most was up here in my head. My ability to do well on tests, my ability to memorize and regurgitate information, my ability to succeed in the world, everything that I was told that mattered really was connected to my cognition from a young age. Were tested and categorized based on those tests into different groups. And being with people living with dementia started to show me other ways of knowing, other ways of connecting. As one woman I worked with, who, her short-term memory when I met her was about 3 minutes, so for those of you who love someone living with dementia, you're having a conversation about every 3 minutes it restarts. And so she never remembered my name. But for people that she knew, like myself, when she'd see you walking around in the community, she'd look at you, you could see her processing. And I love how little shame she had about it. And she would just go, I don't know you here, but I know you here. And that interaction really sums up what I was learning. I was learning not to know things here, but to know them here. And that there is ways to know things in our heart and ways to know things in our body, and that we really need all of those ways of knowing to help fix, honestly, a lot of the loneliness and isolation and anxiety and depression that all of us feel. And so that's really where I began to see people living with dementia as showing us kind of something that as a culture we were missing. And the flip side of that also being that if we lived in a world that valued other ways of knowing more, we would value people living with dementia more. And then I don't think that we would cloister them away like we do into long-term care. So basically, I was like, I have all these stereotypes. I'm meeting these people. They don't match up to them. Why the heck did I have all these wrong ideas about people living with dementia? And when I unpacked that, I realized the root of it was really ageism. So ageism being a bias or discrimination against someone because of their perceived age. There's definitely ageism along the lifespan, but we have a preference for adults over younger people or over older people. People in middle age is definitely our cultural preference as far as who we give power to. And then also ableism. So discriminating against people because they aren't neurotypical, meaning their brains don't work the way that most brains do, and because they have cognitive change. And ever since then, I've now been doing a variety of work. I do coaching with families and people around ageism and issues of dementia. And then I also do a lot of writing and speaking and sharing, because my hope is that the more of us that have these insights and can see people beyond the stereotypes, the more we can both learn from dementia, how to heal some of the ills of everyday life, and also we can help make our world a bit more dementia inclusive. And so to explore that a little bit more, I'm going to go back through the book and we're going to unpack some of the ideas in it. But I just wanted to give you a sense of where these ideas came from, and what it means. So when you get the actual book and you turn to the first page, there's a glossary in it, which I think is important. And so in this glossary, there's a couple concepts that are important. So you see here these glass bottles. They are useful vessels, and I'm going to use that as a metaphor for our adult selves. We are useful vessels. And I say we because I just turned 35 last week. I think I'm pretty solidly in adulthood, in the age that is granted, credence in our society. I finally got over the hump of having enough experience for people to not think it's my first day at work, I feel like. But we're useful vessels. We go out, we get jobs, we're productive, and our value is really based on how productive we are and what we can do and what we can add. And I don't know if any of you like this, but I grew up on the beach and I've collected sea glass my whole life, these little worn treasures, pieces of glass that get hidden in the sand. And I always thought it was so fun to find them. And I would get so excited about this treasure. And as I was thinking about this concept of dementia, I found it's actually a pretty good metaphor for how I see people living with dementia. That, in adulthood, we are useful vessels, and at some point, the world sees us as not so useful anymore, and we get discarded. Talk to anybody who's trying to find a job later in life. They will tell you just how much ageism there is out there that makes that hard. So you get discarded, you get smashed and beaten up by life, not that great, tumbled around in the waves and worn into treasures by time and waves. So just seeing this metaphor of, yes, glass bottles are great, they're super useful, but I see sea glass as a treasure, and it's something different whose value isn't in its use at all. Its value is in, its rarity and its beauty, and just similar to art, it has a value all its own. And so I love this as a metaphor of sort of for life, that we become this useful vessel. And yeah, things happen, suffering happens. I want to be really clear. I get called Pollyanna a lot. I am fully aware of the suffering that comes with living life, especially living life with dementia. Personally, I just think that gets a lot of airtime. So I'm trying to give airtime to the other side of the story as well. I don't deny it at all. There's more to the story than just the suffering. So yeah, two other definitions that are important thinking about this is whole. So being in an undamaged state and in one piece. And then in our society, we tend to think that healing means to make whole. We go to the doctor to get better, to be made back whole. But anyone who suffered a loss, whether it's of an arm or a spouse or an ability, knows that healing isn't actually about going back to a state of wholeness. Healing is about going forward and finding our next way of being. And so I feel like these two concepts of whole and healing, moving forward to a new way of being, and this metaphor is really helpful to hold how I see dementia. So the sea glass has moved forward into a new way of being. It's not a whole bottle anymore. It never will be a whole bottle again. It's something new, and it's finding that new normal. When you were looking at the images, which we'll go through again, they were representing my concept of our consciousness throughout the lifespan. So when we're going to go through it again, here's what I want you to know is I see red as cognition. Cognition is the kind of activity our brain does that we can measure with tests. So if you, let's say, have a diagnosis of dementia and you went and got a mini mental status exam from a doctor, that's measuring your cognition. An IQ test measuring your cognition. It's thinking, the part of our brain that's like a computer, that's cognition, and that's going to be represented in red. Yellow represents all of our other ways of knowing. So that knowing in our heart that I talked about, our emotional way of knowing. So usually this yellow is, you would say, I feel. So I feel like something isn't right, not I know something isn't right, right? So it's a way of knowing that's in your body or in your emotions. So all those somatic ways of knowing, the prickles on the back of your neck, the knowing you love someone just by looking at them. That is what the yellow is going to represent in these portraits of consciousness. And the blue represents what I call the un. And so un stands for the unknown, the unconscious, the unfathomable, the unexplainable. So this is just all the other stuff that we don't know. Whether we're thinking in the work of Carl Jung about the collective unconscious, whether we're thinking about things we just don't yet understand yet with science. Blue represents everything that is unknown. And then there's going to be a black circle throughout the paintings. And that represents our awareness, our consciousness, what we know and are aware of. And so there's, of course, things you've probably heard, in our subconscious and unconscious that we're unaware of, or information we haven't come across yet that we're unaware of. So the stuff outside that black circle is everything that for whatever reason we don't know yet. And within the circle is everything we're consciously aware of. So yeah, the first page, when we're born, we use very little cognition. You can see here, we're not even aware of what we know or we don't know. There's barely any cognition. There's some more like other ways of knowing. When we're born, we're just sponges. We're learning from the world. We're grabbing input from all directions and starting to make sense of things. And so just like our brain is our same brain we take through our life, I want you to know too, these watercolors you see were all done on a single sheet of paper with a lot of drying time in between, to sort of show that there is no like fresh slate ever. Everything is going to build on its own as we move forward. So we become a kid and we start to learn to name the world. This is where this awareness comes in now. You see that dotted black line. We know what we know, and there's other stuff outside of that that we don't know that we don't know. We become aware of ourselves. We become aware of the names of things. We start to label things. We start getting ideas about what's better to be or not. We start getting biases, all that kind of stuff. We begin to understand the world. You can just see these shootouts of that red, that cognition. That's us naming things, us learning how to do math, how to define things, how the world works. But we're still pretty encompassed in those other ways of knowing too. Kids are really in touch with what's a little bit more unknowable about the world, what they feel in their bodies. They're, much more in tune with that. And they really continue to delight in the and all its mystery. Just look at a kid reading a fairy tale, playing an imaginative game. They are just so much more in tune with that than us adults. Then when we get to this cult of adulthood, as I call it, and I call it that just because our world so overvalues adulthood, we really try to turn kids into little mini adults. We're always asking them what they want to be when they grow up. And we also try to stay adults for as long as possible, which you can catch whenever anyone says, I'm still working. Anytime you hear someone using the word still, that's trying to hold on to that adulthood. Like we're at any age allowed to do what we want. So still has no place in it. That's actually some ageism creeping up. But I could go down a whole tangent on that. But yeah, in adulthood, our cognition serves us, right? You got to get good grades, get into a good school, to get a good job. So we rely on it more and more. You can see here that red is really big. I know I experienced this. This is where I was at before I started working with people living with dementia. I was like, all right, if I can get my brain to do it, that's what matters. That's what's valuable. And most of us, right? This isn't all of us, but most of us stop listening to our body and our heart. And we think our mind is really the one that knows best. We also get pretty solid ideas that like we kind of start to think that what we know is all that there is. You can see that black line getting a little bit stronger. The border between our conscious and unconscious is a little bit more concrete. And when we do that, what's outside of what we're aware of, you can see that gets a little scarier when we're less in tune with our body and we're less in tune with the fact that there's so much we don't know. When we're in the heights of this cult of adulthood, many of us forget, and you see forget there in quotes, because we think of forgetting as part of dementia, but I would say adults forget the value of the and we begin to fear that unknown, unconscious, and unexplainable. I feel like we see this theme a lot in stories of kids helping open the hearts of adults and remind them of the magic that's in the world and the things that really matter. And for me, people living with dementia do that too. They help us really connect back to what really matters. So dementia etymologically it translates to out of mind. You see, I've crossed that out because we're going to write a new definition for it. So in this conceptualization, I'm kind of seeing dementia as we've got that fortress of cognition and we're holding it together. And all of a sudden, those other ways of knowing just crack in. They crack that fortress of cognition. And this is really unsettling and upsetting in a world that really values being able to remember exactly where you put your car keys and the exact steps to get to the grocery store. And also has created a world where there aren't any, there are not any buffers. If you forget how to do these things, you get caught out and it can actually be really dangerous. But yeah, so there's this fortress of cognition, other ways of knowing overpower it and come cracking in. And just as I said, in a world that values the mind and cognition above all else, the shift in conscious causes socially imposed suffering. And again, so I say socially imposed because I like to look at how much of the suffering associated with dementia is because we don't have structures in place to support people of different cognitive abilities. So borrowing from the physical ability world, curb cuts, the part of the sidewalk that slopes down to match perfectly with the road, were advocated for by the disability rights activists and got past to something that's possible. And you know what? People in wheelchairs do use curb cuts and they make their day easier. They also make the day easier for any of us who might have an injury or might be pushing a stroller or carrying a suitcase. And I would love to see our world create curb cuts for cognitive change. So how can we make it so that if you get lost, it's a little easier to find your way home? How can we make, and there's a whole bunch we could dig into this about how our homes are actually what disable us and are unsafe because they're built only for this small population of able-bodied, minded adults, rather than having stoves that automatically turned off and lots of other different things that we could do to make the world work for people living with dementia. So I'm a big advocate of inclusive, universal design, of inclusive design, where we use, the frailest among us to design for all of us. If we use them as our guides to design, we actually get a world like those curb cuts that's much easier for all of us. So once the fortress of cognition is broken, valiant and horrific efforts are made to return to the way things were or to hide the changes. And I say valiant or horrific because I think the way I understand and have deep compassion for and respect for anyone, especially after this year, for anyone who works in long-term care. And I think we can come up with a better solution than warehousing our elders. And that's what I mean here, is eventually we hide the person experiencing under the false pretense of healing and caring. And I think that when we look at our world, we don't want to be reminded of our mortality. We don't want to be reminded that our abilities might change. And so we really do hide people away. We push them away. We're age segregated along the lifespan from kindergarten through adulthood, but we see this most pronounced with people with cognitive change in their older years. But as I've been saying all along, the phenomenon of dementia can be a teacher, a guide, and a guru. And it can show us ways, just like I was saying, we can learn from it on how to heal our cognition-obsessed world. We can make those curb cuts, if you will, both in our physical environment and in the way we relate to each other, valuing other ways of knowing. It can teach us to value all the ways of knowing and the unknown. And so to heal dementia in our world, we have to choose to value childhood, which we're pretty good at, right? That raw material, that magicalness. Value the youthfulness of adulthood. Yes, super important to have those productive years, super important to be an adult. I'm enjoying my adulthood, nothing wrong with that. But after adulthood comes something else, and we want to treasure elderhood. So this third life phase, and you can see here the painting again took a lot of layers of white watercolor. We can really have a cohesive blend of cognition, other ways of knowing, and the unknown. And the elders that I've met, both living with dementia and not, and I say elder is someone who's become wise with time, who's intentionally, through life experience, has something back to give. We can integrate all these ways of knowing. And this last quote is actually from someone I knew living with dementia, forming a brilliant clarity of unimpeded awareness. And he said that, what if my mind got so clear that it would just be a brilliant clarity of unimpeded awareness? And I got to know him as he moved towards that. And he really did have that be his experience with dementia. So just to end with a little bit about me, I recognize I am not an elder. I'm a crone in training, and I'm not experiencing dementia, but I do choose to value the experience of dementia and those living it. And this choice has reduced suffering in my life and in the world. And I trust in elderhood, including dementia, to heal our world. And I truly hope that you will join me on this quest, because changing our culture starts with changing each of us.
You call yourself crone in training. Why is that?
Yes, so a crone, for people who don't know, is an archetype from fairy tales and mythology. The parallel would be like the wise old man, so sort of the feminine parallel, wise old woman. I would say anyone who wants to embrace their feminine side can call them a crone, regardless of their sex or gender. So she's a wise old woman, and I truly believe that our world needs its elders and that we need to train to become them. So the same way when we're kids, we definitely train to become adults. As adults, we need to train to become elders. So calling myself a crone in training is my little daily reminder that I need to train to become an elder. And I like crone because it's reclaiming a bit of a word too of like the hag. And the crone archetype, when you dig into it, really holds all that I think it is to be feminine, both the light and dark of the feminine side, the enchantress and the hag. It's a really complex archetype where I feel like a lot of current models, especially for people who identify as women, to grow older, it's like you either become the sweet little granny in the corner or the evil wicked witch, and those both seem pretty one-dimensional to me. So the crone is really multi-dimensional. So it's just a reminder for myself to start cultivating the lessons I've learned from those older than me, of learning to slow down, learning to be in touch with my emotional side and my somatic side. Yeah, just that daily reminder of little practices of, I try to see my wrinkles and gray hair the same way I looked forward to the changes that accompanied puberty in my appearance. Of like, ooh, what will I look like? Will my hair be white? Will it be silver? Will it be salt and pepper? When will it change? And what pattern will it change? How will wrinkles accentuate certain expressions on my face? What expression do I want to make sure to make a lot so I have those wrinkles? All that kind of stuff. It's just my way of remembering to train to become the elders that I wish our world would have.
Very good. Somebody asked, if I know someone who is recently diagnosed with dementia, what should I do?
Mm-hmm. So the stories of being diagnosed with dementia are pretty horrific. Most people I've talked to, there's some amazing doctors out there who will really hold your hand with compassion and love. Most folks that I've interacted with who've had this experience kind of just get told, like, here's your dementia diagnosis, now go home and get your affairs in order, your life is over. So the first thing I want to say to anyone with a diagnosis is, your life is not over. A new chapter has begun. It is time to heal, and using our definition of healing, of moving forward and finding a new normal. So I would say the first steps would be get plugged into advocacy groups of people who are living well with dementia. Dementia Action Alliance is a great place to start for that. Also look in your community and see if there's a dementia-friendly chapter. They started in the UK. They're getting pretty popular here in America. They help businesses and local folks know how to best interact with people with dementia, start volunteering with them, really just start getting plugged into who's around you that can set a good example of how to live well in your community with dementia and can help you sort of buffer against that tide of so much of what we hear is just, like I said, so much of it's the tragedy narrative of your life is over, all of the bad stereotypes. And there is a whole nother world there too. There are totally challenges that you're going to need to face. But I would say first steps is find some really good mentors that can show you how to live well with dementia. And there's some amazing advocacy groups all over the country and world doing that.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit more? You already started talking about what a dementia inclusive world would look like, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I say, notice I didn't say dementia friendly, because I don't want things added on. I mean, I love the term dementia friends, and dementia friendly communities are great. I want to take it even one step further to inclusive. I've been talking a lot about inclusivity, along the lines of gender and ethnicity recently. And we want inclusivity across all parts of identity, including cognitive and physical abilities. And so, yeah, sort of like I mentioned a little bit, using people living with dementia and the frailest among us as our guides for design. So little things, like I said too, of like a stove that has a sensor, our stoves that have sensors in them where it turns off if a fire starts. Things like that. Like, so just sort of thinking about what are the things that would be necessary. Honestly, even motion censored lights under your bed that dim on and off so that you don't trip when you get out of bed. Super helpful for lots of us. Lights when you come into a room that dim on are easier for eyes that age, and also less jarring for individuals in general. So I would love to see, community designers, interior designers really partner with people living with dementia and people of all ages and abilities to design super inclusive spaces and to really see people living with dementia as our guides. And there's some really good examples of this in the Netherlands. There's like the Dementia Village and things. And when we have people living with dementia integrated with people who aren't in a space that is safe for all, it really is better for everyone. And there's a lot less care needed, it could reduce costs for care, all sorts of things. We could go on and on about that. But the bottom line of it is using people living with dementia as a guide for how we need to design our world. And the same way we have prosthetics and different assistive devices for physical differences, I would love to see more of those for cognitive differences. I will say all of us use a cognitive device in that our phone. Most of us don't have phone numbers memorized anymore because we have them all in our phone, and that is totally a cognitive assistance device. So finding just some more of those and making technology even more user friendly to really empower us versus disable us.
Yeah. We were talking off air, Kyrié. You had written numerous articles for the Huffington Post, and one that I found I keep going back to was titled "Dementia 101: Therapy Can Help." Can you speak to the different types of therapies for those individuals, depending upon the stage that they're in?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when let's say you're just diagnosed and you're in early stage, pretty traditional talk therapy is going to be really helpful. There's going to be a grieving process for the changes in abilities, and for the loss of maybe the idea of the future you had that is now shifted. So I would definitely, going to want a more traditional therapy. Totally works in early stage. I would highly recommend focusing on someone who has experience with grief and loss, because that is going to be a big part of it. We have an imagined life for ourselves, and a dementia diagnosis usually isn't part of that imagined life. So there's a bit of an adjustment factor there. When you're in more of the mid stages of dementia, and so for a lot of folks in those stages, again, the other ways of knowing in our body and in our hearts come more to the surface, and a lot of times our words, which I'm using, a lot of here today to communicate, are a little harder to find. It's harder to find the right word. It might be harder to process what words people are saying at you. So that traditional talk therapy might start being less effective. So you're going to want to look for someone who specializes in expressive arts therapy, something that you can start thinking more symbolically. You can do things with your body, so thinking like a drama therapist, art therapist, lots of amazing modalities in the expressive arts world, but it's just other ways to express how you're feeling, to process it, to work through it. And then in the later stages of dementia, I've seen amazing work done using process work, which is just really being with and attuning to the person, being in their environment. It's so far beyond language. It's extraordinarily difficult to talk about. But one of the easiest ways to explain process is in any given conversation, there's the context, which would be the transcript, and there's the process, which would be everything else that's happening to communicate. And so process work really looks at focusing on that everything else. So you might focus on a hand tremor, maybe even like mimic it with a person and start to just sort of unpack what unmet need might that be expressing. There's amazing work being done in the process work world. And I will say all three of those forms of therapy are super helpful for everyone, regardless of their cognitive ability. But I feel like it's helpful to know. So often we think, oh, they can't remember, therapy doesn't matter. And I'm a really big proponent of it does. I have lived experience with that of it's super helpful for the elder or person living with dementia to be able to express themselves, which is a super important part of being human, to be able to process things. It's also really important, especially in later stages, to help translate unmet needs so that they can be met. You can make changes in the environment and things. So a lot of stuff that's currently medicated away, agitation, aggression, we have all these terrible words for people just expressing themselves, can really be met through therapy and using that lens of like, okay, what need isn't being met and how can we meet it with a change in environment, a change in routine, something like that. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Jason. That's something I'm pretty passionate about.
Absolutely. A couple more questions have come in. Somebody asked, the ADA seems to ignore dementia. Do you think this is true?
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. I think, it goes beyond, I would say it's probably not the ADA's fault. It is just so baked into our culture to ignore people with cognitive change, and especially older people. So those with dementia, it's sort of that there's a term, intersectionality, by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she initially developed it to talk about how the experience of Black women is different. The racism that Black women experience is different than the racism Black men experience, and the sexism Black women experience is different than the sexism white women experience. So these different isms, when they overlap and compound, they create a different experience. And so I would say what's probably happening there is that the ADA, while very aware of ableism, might need some help waking up to ageism, which I know actually a lot of the disability justice activists that I'm in touch with are starting to realize that they need more of a mixed age space. But I would say, yeah, what we're seeing there with the ADA's less of a focus on dementia is that intersection of ageism and ableism combining to really, you know, make people living with dementia just outside of the consciousness of most people until you have a loved one or something in your life happens where you realize that there's this whole group of people living kind of under our cultural radar.
Excellent. Well, Kyrié, this has been amazing listening to you. This is our second time together. Hope we can get you back down the road. But how can people find you?
Yes, absolutely. We have a slide for that. Yeah, so you can find me. So yeah, like as I mentioned before, I do one-on-one work. I also do a lot of writing, group workshops, and speaking gigs. So if you want to get in touch with just me, you can go to my website, curiosity.com. There's a contact form on it that goes straight to my email, and I'll email you back. If you're interested in learning more about ageism, one of the projects that I co-founded is oldschool.info, and it is a clearinghouse of anti-ageism resources, and we do a bunch of events and things. We have a weekly clubhouse. We have quarterly meetups of ageism advocates. It's a great way to get plugged in. Everything on there is free and open source. We have DIY workshops, one of which I gave on an earlier episode here of Knowledgeable Aging. It's an awesome resource. And then I'd also direct you to changingaging.org, which is a blog started by Dr. Bill Thomas that I'm currently the managing editor of, that really focuses on foregrounding stories of people who are changing the narrative around aging. And so those are really great ways for you to get plugged in. As I'm sure was eminently clear, I'm very passionate about this. So please, please do not hesitate to email me, you know, even if it is just a, hey, I was just diagnosed, what should I do? I will send you a long list of, hey, get plugged in with this group, talk to these people. One COVID silver lining is that so many amazing resources are now available via video conferencing, which has really made it much more inclusive and easy to access for lots of folks. So yes, please do get in contact. I'd love to hear from all of you. And you can, if you want a copy of the book in person, it's on Amazon, Healing Dementia, with my name. And if you, for some reason, if you work somewhere like a doctor's office or a community and you want to get more than one copy, we've had, you know, like Elko County bought a bunch to their dementia friendly group, bought a bunch to put in doctor's offices all around there to help sort of just wake up people to this idea about dementia. So if you want bulk order, just email me and we can figure that out. I think that's all the things. Did I miss anything, Jason?
Now, Kyrié, I wasn't sure if you actually spelled out your website for those who'll be listening to our podcast.
Yes. So my website it's a play on my name and the word curiosity, KYRIEOSITY.com. And then Old School is old school, OLDSCHOOL.info, INFO. And Changing Aging is CHANGINGAGING.org.
Very good. Well, thank you once again, Kyrié. As far as Knowledgeable Aging, you can go to our website, knowledgeableaging.com. You'll see all of our upcoming and archived webinars. Go to our YouTube page. I encourage you to subscribe. We update that 4 to 5 times per week. If podcasts are your thing, you can find us on Apple Tunes, Spotify, etc. Till next time, I'm your host, Jason Kotar. This is Knowledgeable Aging.